For the second half of our event, we're hosting a plenary session to share learnings from some of our most notable incident investigations and to talk about how human decision-making impacts safety across all of our technologies. We'll also be exploring the roles that each of us play in the safety system. So let's get started with our plenary session. Our moderator for this session is Lisa Monica Amor, the Director of Operations for Technical Safety BC. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Courtney. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our plenary session, The Outcomes of Choices, Learning from Incidents Beyond Your Industry. I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded territory of the Katzie First Nation. You should see the agenda for today's session on your screen here shortly. We encourage you to continue to use the question and answer function at the bottom right of your screen to ask questions throughout the presentation, and we'll answer them during our Q&A period at the end. Let's get to it. I'd like to introduce our two panelists. Joining us, and please welcome, Ryan Hazlitt, Leader of Incident Investigations, and Dean Schmidtke, Senior Safety Officer, Incident Investigations. Ryan, can you provide us with an overview of your program and how it relates to learning from incidents?
Hi, Lisa, and hi, everybody else as well. Learning from incidents is really what we're here to do, and the incident investigation program, I'm biased, but is an important part of Technical Safety BC's oversight. So incidents, we know, can shake people's confidence in the safety system. They can be physically traumatic, it can be mentally traumatic for everyone involved. And that's why we, as a regulator, have established an independent department to oversee investigations and to understand what happens so the organization can work to prevent the same types of incidents in the future.
Certainly a worthy focus. Today, we'll be exploring the connection between technical incidents and human stories by sharing our findings from a fatal ammonia release incident and further explaining how these learnings are applicable to all technologies. The three topics we'll be covering are decommissioning, communication, and directing work. I know there are a lot of people listening who are not from the refrigeration industry. So Ryan, before we jump into the details, can you share with us why this is applicable to everyone in the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to recognize that we have a lot of different technologies. And I think what we really want to emphasize here is that this isn't actually a story about equipment. It's a story about people and how they make decisions in often dynamic situations. Technical Safety BC regulates a variety of equipment and work for the reason that it contains some inherent risk. And we rely on owners, qualified people, other duty holders in the safety system to manage that risk every single day. And in most cases, that's done very effectively. In other words, safety is a shared responsibility, as our strategy says, or put another way, we're each accountable for the specific roles that we play in upholding safety. So in our incident investigation team, we take the mindset that people are working every day to prevent incidents in our safety system. And we also know that they're faced with dynamic situations that can create issues with making those decisions. So there's many different factors at play, fatigue, money, regulations, procedures, the changing climate that can all factor into how those decisions are made. So what our investigation seeks to understand is how the context and environment that those decisions are made in can be more conducive to safety in the future. So to summarize, the learnings from our incident investigations are really not about a specific technology in most cases, or a piece of equipment. They're about people and the environment that they work on, which really makes them universal. So I hope this will become clear as we go through our examples.
Thanks, Ryan. As mentioned, the primary incident we'll be referencing today, which we'll walk through the learnings for, is the Kamloops ammonia release that occurred in May 2022. We recently published our investigation this past year, and I'm wondering if you can just walk us through and remind us of what actually happened.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So as some people might be aware, this incident happened approximately 2 years ago now, almost to the day, actually. And it was an ammonia release at an industrial ice making facility in the interior of BC. And unfortunately, it led to one fatality. What you see in the photograph above here is essentially a cloud of pure ammonia vapor that had filled the building and resulted in that fatality. It was a tragic incident for everyone involved, which is why it's extremely important that we take the time to learn from it. If you aren't from the ammonia or refrigeration industry, you might not have heard this story or the findings and how they might apply to you. So we're going to talk about some of the specific findings and how they actually apply to other technologies that our audience may own or work or interact with.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for providing that overview. Can you share with us the first finding that we'll be highlighting today to industry?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So the first finding is that the Kamloops incident really helped us to clarify or define the line for decommissioning. So what I mean by that is there's a certain point at which the removal of regulated equipment still requires the involvement of qualified and skilled people. And so we're trying to help understand where that line is.
And as we seek to make this applicable to all of the members who have joined us today in the audience, can you share with us what the Safety Standards Act says about decommissioning work?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Safety Standards Act is actually really clear, and it applies across all of our technologies, excluding rail, but all of our energy technologies. And so removal or decommissioning of a regulated product is regulated work. And so that means you need licensed contractors and qualified individuals to do this work. But there is a point that's maybe less clear, and that's the point at which regulated equipment effectively becomes a hunk of metal that's ready for disposal. And so we're hoping to clarify where that line is today.
That's great, thank you. And with the Act broadly applying to all technologies, bringing us back to the incident that we're talking about today, the Kamloops ammonia release incident, can you walk us through the details and the findings that relate to decommissioning specific to this incident?
Yeah, so the Kamloops ammonia release exemplified the reasons why qualified people need to be involved in decommissioning work, at what point they can hand over the key, so to speak, so that other workers who aren't qualified in dealing with these hazardous or potentially hazardous substances without the proper knowledge, they can eventually interact with this system in a safe way, and it'll still be safe while they do that. So the photograph above shows an ammonia receiver. It's a pressure vessel that's part of a larger ammonia system, and everyone who was involved in the decommissioning of this system was under the impression that the system was empty. Other parts of the system were actually empty because they were emptied into this receiver. This valve that's in the photograph is a very consequential valve to the incident. It was in the way of the rigging process for taking this piece out of the building. The handle was sticking out just a little bit. And so one of the workers, again, believing the system was empty, opened this valve to remove or to move it out of the way. And unfortunately, as a result, released the ammonia that was in this receiver into themselves and the building. So what we found in the incident is that a qualified person was never tasked with the specific role of removing the ammonia and making this system safe. There were qualified people there, but it wasn't specifically their role. So the question we have is, as an owner of a piece of equipment, how do I know when something changes from a regulated piece of equipment to a hunk of metal? And what this Kamloops incident helped us to clarify is that we have to specifically hire a qualified individual to assess the system, deal with those remaining risks, and clearly inform the owners that it's ready for final removal. And then and only then can we be assured that it can be safely removed and disposed of. So following this incident, this tragic incident, Technical Safety BC worked with a number of safety partners to implement code changes that address safety commissioning in the refrigeration code. They've already been included into the latest edition of the refrigeration code. We've also issued a directive to manage this risk in BC immediately while we wait for adoption of that. That's what's highlighted in the second image above. So just wanted to point out that this work is ongoing and has already been addressed in this industry.
Thanks for sharing, particularly that we've applied this learning in a really meaningful and impactful way. We've been speaking to an incident specific to the refrigeration industry. We've seen some questions in our first segment from elevating and imagining there's, potentially some electricians or gas fitters in the audience. They might be asking, how is this relevant if I do most of my work on different equipment or even in houses or homes? We're going to take a moment to review some insights from the field, and I want to share a few observations from our safety officers around what they've seen related to decommissioning. I'm going to read straight from the screen, not my favorite thing to do, but some folks might just be listening. Some things we've heard from our safety officers include demolition companies are often tasked with dismantling electrical without the expertise to ensure it's properly disconnected from all power first. Another safety officer noted that tenants ending their occupancy often remove their electrical infrastructure, leaving live dangling wires that are hazardous for incoming occupants. Finally, another safety officer noted, I've seen pieces of systems get removed and the piping is just isolated with valves. It's much safer to have the system emptied prior to removal to eliminate the hazard. Building on these observations across technologies, Dean, can you lead us through a more in-depth example from a different technology?
Yeah, sure, Lisa. It's maybe initially evident that, from the previous example we've seen in Kamloops, that the risks with an industrial refrigeration plant can be significantly different than something you may encounter in a home or a house, for example. But at the same time, as owners, we have similar decisions to make around decommissioning. For example, if I wanted to remove a gas furnace or fireplace or a range, or maybe take out an old electrical circuit, there's still consequences on how it can be done safely. And I want to be clear that consequences can still be significant. And this just reminds me of an incident that we investigated last year in the interior of BC. So a homeowner on a rural property needed to replace a propane hot water tank. They decided that they wanted to swap it out for an electrical one. They hired a contractor who had some electrical experience to do the replacement. And when the old hot water tank was removed, the propane gas line to the old water heater was not plugged. It wasn't plugged, it wasn't capped. And that fact was not effectively communicated between that contractor and the owner. Now, at the time the work was being done, a propane storage tank on the property, which was supplying fuel, was empty. So when the work was being done, there wasn't gas leak at this open gas line. But later, when gas was added to the tank and the gas company remotely provided some instruction to the owner on how to turn the gas back on, there was a substantial leak that occurred inside the house through that uncapped gas line. And that leak ultimately resulted in the explosion. You can see here, there was pretty severe damage to the home. You can tell this log home wall was pushed out at the back. The windows and the doors came out of their frames, and quite substantial damage throughout the home. Now, luckily, the homeowner was outside when the explosion happened, so it prevented any major injuries from occurring. So in this case, the removal or decommissioning of that hot water tank created just as many risks, if not more, than the installation of the new electric heater.
This scary incident, and thankfully nobody was significantly injured. Ryan spoke to how our safety management team has already implemented some changes around decommissioning for the refrigeration industry. To what degree is decommissioning referenced in the regulations or codes of some of the other technologies we regulate?
Well, Lisa, to be completely frank, our codes and standards don't often have much guidance when it comes to the equipment and half of its life cycle, near the end when it's being removed and or decommissioned. And Ryan mentioned this already. A lot of those codes and standards mostly focus on things like the installation, commissioning, sometimes maintenance. And, this may be perceived or that there's less hazards associated with the decommissioning of this type of equipment. But these incidents show it's not the case. The hazards just change. I think it's important to realize that changes to things like codes and regulations, they take time. But however, contractors, asset owners, regulators, we can start collectively making changes now. Part of what we're doing as an organization, we're working to inform the public, inform the clients that decommissioning is already considered regulated work under the Safety Standards Act, and that qualified people need to be engaged by owners to deal with this end of stage of equipment at the end of its life cycle. So hopefully by telling some of these stories, it can help raise awareness that these risks exist, and that hopefully it can encourage people to engage qualified, knowledgeable people for this work across all of our regulated technologies.
And awareness is certainly the first step to making that shift and that change. Thank you, Dean. Let's move on to our next key learning. I'll now pass it back to Ryan to share our second takeaway from today, going back to the Kamloops incident.
Thanks, Lisa. So the second insight that we gained in investigating that tragic incident is that there was a big knowledge gap that existed between the state of the system that the contractors understood and the ones who worked on it last, and the state of the system that the owners understood. So as part of our investigations, we interviewed the contractor who had last worked on the system, and they were very clear. They never emptied the system of ammonia. The owners, on the other hand, they had the belief that the system had been emptied. So I think this begs the question, how exactly does this happen? And that's exactly what we tried to answer. So there are a number of issues with communication that contributed to this incident, but fundamentally, a lot of it comes down to the fact that the owners are often not technical experts in the system, and that's why they hire contractors. Contractors, on the other hand, you are technical experts, but getting that information across properly to someone who isn't, that can be challenging. And we're often communicating across this big gap in technical knowledge. And so what we identified is that it's very crucial that we take the time to create a shared understanding between the owners, those people who are decision makers, and the qualified people who are actually doing the work on the system.
It sounds like it's a matter of both what is being communicated, how it's being communicated, and then how it's being received ultimately. Staying on the topic of communication, we're going to jump back to some field level observations, and I'll be sharing some more insights from our safety officers and what they've seen in the way of communication. We have one safety officer that noted installation contractors often don't communicate manufacturer maintenance requirements to owners, which can lead to systems being poorly maintained. Another safety officer noted maintenance contractors may not communicate hazards that would require shutdown or downtime in order to avoid inconveniencing the owner in order to keep the contract. And finally, another safety officer noted, I often see service invoices for safety critical components that are too general, making it hard to understand what was actually tested and how it was done. Now that we've shared some insights and learnings around communication from in-field, we have a poll for you, the audience. Do you agree with this statement? I've been in a situation where an owner or contractor misinterpreted a communication about regulated work or equipment. Yes, no, not sure. We'll give you a few moments. I'm seeing lots of responses come in, so that's exciting. Certainly an overwhelming response of yes, which I don't think is surprising, but perhaps is quite concerning given what we're talking about here today. And that wraps up the poll. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your answers. And again, overwhelmingly, with 70% of folks saying yes, they do agree with this statement. We're going to revisit the Kamloops ammonia incident and take a look at the impact of ineffective communication. Ryan, I was really intrigued by the range of communication pertaining to the incident. Can you walk us through your findings?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And what's really interesting, those poll results are very interesting because, I mean, that is in line with what we're seeing in the field, that communication is often something that plays a role in preventing incidents, but can also be one of those things that can contribute to it as well. So I'm going to bring up what we call a word cloud from the Kamloops ammonia incident. And what this is showing is the variety of terms or words that were used by individuals, found on invoices or found on paperwork during our investigation that we identified of the Kamloops ammonia incident. And you'll notice there's a lot of words here, and some of them mean similar things. Others mean very different things. Others mean different things to different people. And so I think what we want to point out here is that oftentimes that even something as simple as a choice of words can impact an incident. In this case, two of the words I'm going to highlight are pumped out and pumped down on the left side of the screen. Now, if you're not from the ammonia refrigeration industry, those might sound very, very similar, but in fact, they mean very different things. So pumped down is what occurred in this case, and it's what the contractor was stating that they did, and that's moving the ammonia from one portion of the system down into that pressure vessel, the receiver that we showed earlier. Whereas pumped out is actually the removal of ammonia out of the system. And so in this case, the contractor was clear that they pumped down the system. The owners, though, were less clear on what that meant. There was even a reference at one point from the contractor that residual ammonia was removed. What wasn't clear is that this was actually from a few isolated pipes in the system, not the system as a whole.
A range of references, and not only were there different terms used, but each of those terms might have had varied meanings to the people involved in the conversation. It seems as though communication, especially between qualified and non-technical folks, is a crucial factor in preventing incidents. Dean, I'm guessing you were going to tell me that this isn't the only place this has come up in your incident investigations.
Yeah, that's correct, Lisa. An example I have here, we investigated an amusement ride incident last summer. The amusement ride itself was a very dramatic, high speed, high energy, exhilarating ride. And during its operation, for one of the riders, the over-shoulder restraint, which holds the rider tightly in their seat, had significantly loosened during the operation of this ride. It could be, pretty understandable that rider, as they're on this ride, was extremely frightened by this. And when this happened, shortly after exiting the ride, that rider experienced a seizure and had to receive some medical treatment. Now, it's important to note there wasn't actually a risk of the rider being ejected from the ride. There was, a redundant system that was ensuring that the restraint could only move a limited amount, but there was no way for the rider to understand this, which, contributed to their fear level. They weren't sure of what was going on. So our investigation found that there had been an intermittent issue with a valve for this primary restraint system. And at times this restraint would not release at the end of the ride, and it would require the operator to manually open this valve to release the restraint and allow the rider to exit. Before this incident occurred, the operator had noted this on not only the initial ride setup checklist, but also on subsequent daily inspection checklist forms, noting that this valve releasing the restraint was not functioning correctly and needed repair. And here's where the communication, effective transfer of information started to come into play, is that even though the operator put this information on these forms and these forms were submitted and filed, the issue was not directly communicated to the managers and owners who had not been aware of this issue at all until during moments of our investigation when it came to light. So in this case, that common understanding between the operator and the management, would have likely resulted in some different decisions around this ride being operated. Creating that common understanding is the responsibility of both parties. Owners, take the time, understand the work that contractors are doing on your site or your equipment. Are there any hazards identified? What's the state of the system when that contractor leaves? And has that been clearly documented on a work order, invoice? And conversely, contractors and operators, it's vitally important that owners understand, what work you did do, what work you didn't do, if there's any hazards that could still exist. I can think of a lot of situations where partway through a job, work had to pause. So if an owner or an operator isn't aware that the system isn't in a safe state of operation, they could be knowingly exposing themselves to new sets of hazard that weren't there before.
With several contributing factors that lead up to an incident, there's certainly lots for us all to consider when communicating. Each of us play a role, obviously. That's what we're here to really impress upon the audience today. We've talked about the importance of communication. There's different meanings and modes that might be impactful in terms of how people interpret what information is being shared with them. And the challenges surrounding this might also relate to the dynamics of the people involved, for example, peer-to-peer or supervisor to worker. This brings us to our third insight. Directing work means being directly accountable. Before we expand on this, we have another poll for the audience. The poll question, which you'll see up on the screen, is under the Safety Standards Act, providing direction on how to do regulated work to someone who is not qualified could be considered A, hazardous, B, prohibited, C, an offense, or D, all of the above. Again, we'll give you a couple of moments to consider your response. Again, we're seeing overwhelming response for one, and so we'll go ahead and share those results. You should see them on your screen. And it is D, all of the above. So that is the correct answer. Ryan, can you share with us how this factored into the Kamloops ammonia incident?
Yes, and often the more severe the incident, the more things we see that went wrong leading up to it. So something really interesting in this case is we actually had some very knowledgeable people on site in the days leading up to the incident. So people who specifically had a lot of experience with ammonia, one of them a retired contractor of many years, another one, someone who was previously qualified in the United States.
It's really interesting to think that you can have so much knowledge and expertise engaged in the regulated work and still see an incident of this magnitude. What did your findings reveal as to why this incident wasn't prevented?
Yeah, so I think there's a few reasons for that, but I'm going to try and distill it down into one word, and that word is accountability. So these qualified people were never engaged with any specific responsibilities while they were on site. We know from interviews with qualified people in this industry that when they're engaged to look into an ammonia system, they have a specific procedure and steps that they follow, precautions that they take in order to really understand the hazards and be accountable for that work to do it safely. So in this case, these people were on site for different reasons. They had different concerns on their mind, but there were still comments that they made that influenced the work of a lot of people who didn't have the knowledge to make those informed decisions around how to work with the ammonia plant. The picture that we show above here, you can see the black hose leading from one of the valves on a receiver. This is a separate system, also in that same plant. And they had actually the day before identified some ammonia in this system, and they were purging it through water. And as a means to get rid of it before further disassembly. But they didn't associate this with also showing that there could be ammonia in another part of the system. So this purging work was partially informed by these qualified people that were on site. So or people with ammonia knowledge that were on site. So it's our opinion that had they not been involved, had those comments around direction not been made, there's a good chance that the work wouldn't have continued to the point where the incident occurred. Ultimately, they provided direction to unqualified people on how to proceed, but they weren't just directly responsible or accountable for that work. And that's an important part of being a qualified person. That's a role that we want to reinforce here, is that as a qualified person engaged to do regulated work, you're also taking accountability for handling that work safely.
Thanks for that summary, Ryan, and in particular, the connection between accountability and safety. Dean, we have qualified people across all of our regulated technologies. How does this message apply to them?
Well, we want to draw a line around the instructing or directing of unqualified people who engage in work around regulated equipment that could create a hazard, especially if they're not fully aware of the circumstances or the conditions of the equipment. So I can give you an example of this from the previous house explosion incident I referred to. So in that case, when the propane company filled the tank on the property, they closed and left the service valve of the tank closed. There was no fuel flowing out of it. And investigation found that this was standard procedure in industry. It's done, commonly across most propane suppliers. This is just something that they do because the state of the gas system connected to this tank is unknown. So it's a safety precaution or a barrier against incidents that, when a homeowner arrives, the valve is shut off and there's no fuel flowing because of this unknown gas system. So in this instant, when the homeowner did arrive home and found they didn't have propane at the house after they had fuel delivered, they called the propane company. And a representative from the propane company gave them direction over the phone on how to turn the propane tank back on, supply gas back to the house. Now, that instruction was provided without knowing the specifics of the situation, and it ended up causing that leak, which caused the gas explosion, essentially destroying the house.
I'd like to interject here. I think people might question if turning the propane valve on is actually regulated work. Homeowners do that type of thing all the time.
Yeah, you're right. The opening of a propane valve, it's occasionally done by homeowners, and it's something that may, occur occasionally. But the act of doing so, it's directly affecting that regulated gas system. So care needs to be taken when directing any type of work that has any direct effect on that system. So I think we have to look at the context, why it was turned off in the first place. So there was a safety concern there. And, in this case, the homeowner's unaware of how to turn the valve back on. They may also not have the ability to properly assess whether it's safe to turn it back on. This goes back to the comment at the beginning of the presentation that, equipment we regulate as inherent risk. And together we build a safety system, relies on human interactions to keep things safe. So qualified people are a huge piece of that. We rely on them to make safe decisions around directing and informing work, regards to our regulated systems.
Thanks, Dean. Some audience members might be thinking these examples are not particularly relatable. They might be thinking, I only work with qualified people. Can this also occur in interactions between qualified people?
Yeah, we've seen incidents like this as well. Typically, when someone's asking for direction, they may be uncomfortable with something regarding that situation. Likely, they may feel something may be unsafe, or in those situations, it's important not to guess, not to offer any suggestions without direct involvement. As Ryan stated earlier, is accountability. So, for example, we had this situation at an industrial site. There was an electrician who was unsure of the configuration of a piece of electrical equipment. So to get a better understanding, they texted some photographs and some questions to a foreman of theirs who was off-site. Direction was provided back to that electrician via text messages, and ultimately that electrician was injured when they created an arc flash when they made contact with some energized electrical equipment that they expected to be de-energized. You can see in this photo, there's a panel open with some black marks inside from when the arc flash occurred, and even some of the personal effects of the individuals, such as their radio and their safety glasses, which are still on the ground here. And so this example, it shows us that, direction, whether correct or incorrect, can give somebody confidence to proceed maybe when they shouldn't. So unless you fully understand the situation, such as though you would be confident in doing the work yourself, don't give that confidence to others.
Thanks, Dean. It is a really important reminder that confidence can be conveyed through communication, guidance, and direction, and sometimes when it really shouldn't be. Before we start the Q&A portion of our session, let's take a moment to reflect on the role that we all play in the safety system. Perhaps give some thought to what you can do to help prevent incidents from occurring in the future. And as we do so, let's review the key learnings that were shared today. Number one, understand that regulated components and systems may contain hazards when work is being done to remove or replace them. Number two, ensure good communication and documentation practices are followed so others can maintain the same level of understanding. And in particular, that shared understanding that we touched on today, making sure that the message that's being intended is being received and delivered in the manner in which you're hoping it will be. And then, of course, number three, taking accountability when directing others to do regulated work and ensuring all hazards are identified and or mitigated. All right, now it's time for the Q&A. If you have a question, please click on that little button, should be on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom window. And any unanswered questions from today's session will be posted on our website after the event. So the first question we're starting with, are refrigeration plant owner or refrigeration contractors required to log the amount of refrigerant added to or taken out of the refrigeration plant? And I'll pass this one, I think, over to Ryan.
Thanks, Lisa. So I would probably have to defer this a little bit to our technical programs team, but I'll answer to what I can. So I do know that regulated work includes the removal and addition of refrigerant into a system. And so, we want to ensure that that's done with proper documentation. In terms of the actual duty to do so, I'll refer that to our technical programs team and we'll get an answer back on that.
Totally fair. And I think similar to the first half of today, we'll endeavor to answer the questions as best we can with a commitment to follow up in writing. The next question we have, and I imagine a number of people are wondering this, was enforcement action taken against the company in Kamloops for failing to ensure employees were adequately trained to the hazards of ammonia and failing to ensure a system or procedure was in place for the safe removal of ammonia?
Thanks, Lisa. And I somewhat expected this question. And I think what's important to recognize is our team, specifically in incident investigation, we're here to identify the contributing factors for the purpose of incident prevention in the future. Any separate compliance and enforcement investigation would be announced separately. I also want to highlight as well that there's ongoing investigations from other regulators that were involved in this as well, such as DRCMP and WorkSafe, and they also have that option as well. So I can't speak to their investigations. And just again, to highlight that we specifically in our team focus on contributing factors and causes to incidents to inform prevention.
Thanks, Ryan. And a more specific question with regards to the incident has also been entered. And so I'll perhaps keep you with me to answer this one. In regards to the Kamloops ammonia incident, why was the liquid receiver line with the valve in question not capped? Why was there no tag on the receiver showing it had ammonia charge in it? That's a really specific question, and so
Mhm.
curious if you can share with us the answer.
It's a great question. And so one thing I would do is I'll take a moment to refer to our report as well. So our report contains a lot more detail about this incident that discusses the causes, contributing factors, and the events leading up to it. One thing I want to highlight in this specific case is that those people that were disassembling the system, cutting those lines, they were under the impression that the system was empty. And so if they're coming in with that knowledge, an empty system doesn't require a cap. And so when that line was cut, it was done so under the understanding that there was no ammonia behind it or behind the valve below it. Certainly, if we're dealing with a live refrigeration system, this is why it's so important to deal with qualified contractors who are familiar with the proper methods of closing off those systems in a safe way if they do still contain that hazardous substance.
Thanks, Ryan. Another question that's come through: does a contractor have a duty of care to ensure that an owner is aware of hazards or potential hazards in an installation or a decommissioning?
Yeah, I can take this one as well. So there are a variety of duties that are laid out in the Safety Standards Act and the regulation. And one of those duties is to ensure that a system is left in a safe state. We can't expose somebody to a hazardous situation. And so, yes, I would argue that there is a duty. If a hazard exists, when a duty holder, such as a licensed contractor or a qualified person, is on site, that they adequately inform the owner of that or eliminate that hazard.
Thanks, Ryan. We have another comment, which I'll share, and perhaps yourself or Dean will want to respond, not particularly in the form of a question, but I'm still going to share it in the interest of transparency. One audience member noted, you need to go to the root cause here and not blame texting. The individual was unqualified in this case. And so perhaps maybe you can touch on kind of the process or methodology around your program in general, because I happen to know that root cause and or causal factors are a huge area of focus. So I'm not sure if you or Dean wants to take that one.
Yeah, Dean, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Just trying to gain a little understanding around that comment about root cause and text blaming. What I can say is that, you know, there is always discussion of root cause, and it's part of incident investigation. The more incidents that we investigate, the more it becomes evident that a singular root cause is not always, well, very rarely, if ever, the case. When incidents occur, you know, I mentioned safety barriers before. There's several layers of safety barriers which can prevent an incident from happening and can prevent potential impact after an incident occurs. And, you know, in cases where someone is qualified or unqualified is one of those safety barriers. That's why it's important for us to ensure that, you know, qualified people are doing the work. We also know that's not always the case, and we don't want to be solely reliant on that one safety barrier. We have to look at the system from a very broad perspective and try to incorporate everything in there, you know, in anticipation that maybe that barrier might not be effective. So, yeah, when someone's unqualified, it's definitely a relevant component, but we want to also bring in all of the other parts of the system, you know, up from an initial design, certification and testing and manufacturing, installation and operation and maintenance and repair and decommissioning. And as you know, what we said before, encompassing all of the human actions at all of these stages throughout. So we like to look at it not only just as a singular root cause, but as all of the contributing factors and try to weigh them out accordingly and see where, you know, these gaps are and improvements can be made to the system to help close up these safety barriers.
Thanks, Dean. Hopefully that answers or at least addresses that comment that one audience member made. We have another question here. What sort of support do you have for employers with apprentices, and how do we incentivize ownership to hire skilled trades apprentices? Also, can you further define a qualified person pertaining to one trade overseeing another trade's apprentice?
Thanks, Lisa. So I'll break this into two questions. And I think the first, well, it is broken into two questions, but I think the first half, I would have to some extent, defer to another team. So we'll get that portion answered in writing. The second portion around directing apprentices that are outside of your area. There's a very specific clause in the regulation that you can direct, or I believe it's in the act, that you can direct people only within the area of knowledge that you are qualified and certified for. So that's important to keep in mind, that you are both when you're doing work as a qualified individual, but also when you're directing work as a qualified individual, that you're doing it within your realm of expertise.
Thanks, Ryan. We have another comment, which I'm thinking might tie in with some of the findings that you shared with us today, Dean. The comment is, this is why we hire certified contractors. It is your job, presumably us, Technical Safety BC, to inspect their work, not just say, we'll put it on the contractor, we pay for inspection. And so I'm thinking this ties in with some of the comments around the safety system and accountability, ownership, responsibility. It's a bit more of a difficult one, but I'm going to pass it over to you, Dean.
Sure. Yeah, it's a fair statement and a perspective on safety in general. Like, kind of as I was mentioning before, all of these different layers. The certified, qualified people who have the appropriate training to do the work correctly is a big piece of that. They have got their responsibility to do that correctly. And then I was going to say, as an organization, we need to oversee what they are doing and, try to ensure that they're doing it correctly. I don't want to speak too directly to assessments related to qualified work and ratios on permits, but I'm sure we probably could have a detailed answer to that provided from someone better qualified to do it within this organization and get it posted up on the website.
We will have some of that information. I did happen to see some of those questions came through in the first segment as well. And so I think you're correct in relating that comment likely to some of the comments we've seen around permit and inspection ratios. I think it's an interesting tie-in with really what we're talking about today with regards to the investigation findings and the key takeaways here around accountability, decisions, context. We cannot be everywhere all at once. That's just not physically possible. And so what I have found really compelling in our conversation today are some of the learnings around people and the behavior of people and how that behavior is influenced by what's going on around them. And so I think that's where, from my perspective, I have the pleasure of working with safety officers. They can't be in every location at once. And so there's this shared sense of accountability and reliance that all participants in the safety system are adhering to their accountabilities, their duties, and their responsibilities. And it really is something that we share as a responsibility, the safety of British Columbians. So thank you for taking that one, Dean. I'm going to jump to another comment/question. It's a bit of a paragraph, so I'll read it through and then we'll determine who might be best suited to address or if it should be part of the written answers. Someone has said here, hello, as a licensed gas fitter contractor, I've seen countless homeowners purchase gas appliances from wholesalers and home reno stores. It should be mandatory for regulated appliances to be sold to contractors who are licensed specifically for the appliances being sold. If unlicensed homeowners are able to purchase these products, then the wholesaler should have to report the address and name of purchaser to make sure that Technical Safety BC follows up regarding homeowner permits and inspections. So more of a comment in that one, and likely not something that either Dean or Ryan would speak to, but much appreciated. And we can certainly craft a bit of a response or address that in the written follow-up. I know in working with the safety officers, homeowner permitting is certainly an area where we do spend a lot of our time. Our safety officers are extremely passionate and committed to the education that pertains to some of the homeowner inspections that they conduct. So interesting suggestion there.
Yeah, I can add to that too, Lisa.
Sure.
Based on some of my previous experience in the gas industry and whatnot, and even incidents. It's a very interesting take on a solution to try to address these problems. And yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting rationale behind it, and only allowing qualified people to be able to access this type of equipment. It really brings to mind a series of other incidents that we've been seeing increasing over the past years, and that's regulated, uncertified, regulated type equipment, which is now being easily purchased and shipped online, and installed by sometimes qualified, sometimes unqualified people. And the human behavior decisions around this, like Ryan was mentioned, when are these decisions being made, all of the factors that come into it. As a homeowner, I want to install a new water heater in my home, and I can hire a contractor who purchases it. I can go purchase it myself from a local retailer, or maybe there's an option to buy an uncertified, unknown quality component online and have it shipped to my house. There's a significant increase or decrease in things like costs associated with that, but we see an increase in the hazards associated with it as well. So it's not just big box stores selling gas equipment to homeowners. It's a big issue that's broad and is quite complicated when it comes to this type of equipment, being bought, installed, and used within our province as well. So I would love more information on ways we could try to address this and help rein some of this in. But on that topic, that's try to ensure you're having qualified people put in certified products. It just increases safety exponentially, and every time the decision is made away from that, the risk to yourself and others and incidents happening just goes up. So yeah, I think that's a interesting comment to spark some conversation.
I can hear your interest in the topic coming through, Dean, which is exciting. I'm really glad that you mentioned cost. I think that's one of the unfortunate realities and challenges in terms of that context and dynamic that Ryan was touching on, and yourself as well, in terms of reviewing the findings of these incidents. Cost is a driver in terms of decisions and behavior. And so that's a reality that we all face and all have to realize and tackle. And so appreciate you highlighting that as one of the factors that informs decisions that are made, again, across all technologies. Switching gears slightly, but staying along the same lines as in terms of decisions and behavior, I find this to be an interesting question. And I don't know, Ryan, if you'll have some insight in terms of some of the communications you've had with other authorities having jurisdiction. The question here is, are there any efforts made to maintain similar verbiage and definitions with other agencies that duty holders might have to interact with, so that terms have the same meaning throughout the regulatory agencies?
Yeah, interesting question, Lisa. And I'm not sure exactly which verbiage or which agencies they're referring to. I think to some extent that is challenging because, like we said earlier, changing acts and regulations, it does take time, and the definitions in the acts and regulations are built into those. What we do as an organization, when there's questions as to how something can be interpreted or how something relates to potentially how other regulators do it that's causing confusion in industry, is we do have regulatory tools that help assist with that. So a couple of the specific ones that come to mind in this is information bulletins, which are specifically used to clarify requirements in either acts, regulations, or codes. And the other one is a directive, and a directive is a little bit stronger in that it's providing specific clarification that must be followed around a requirement. So we do have those options available, and I would encourage the question writer that if there's a specific term or verbiage that's confusing or creating problems between regulators, for example, or agencies, please reach out to us so that we can work to address that confusion, because that is something, as we mentioned today, creating a shared understanding is important, and we don't want differing understanding. So that's something we can work towards.
It's a great plug for our regulatory tools available on our website, which you can filter with these nifty little buttons. You can select technology, information bulletin, directive, and of course, safety orders, which I find myself to be a great resource. And again, spans across all technologies in terms of relevancy. Jumping back to the Kamloops ammonia incident, Ryan, that's your cue to go off mute shortly here. I've got a couple of questions. I'm going to ask both of them because they are quite specific, not particularly related, but perhaps somewhat. I actually think this first one might be kind of more of a WorkSafe driven question, just based on one of the references. But the first question is, in the Kamloops incident, who is designated prime, and does this factor come into play in this case? And then the second question, in the end, who is responsible for Kamloops incident, the owner or the contractors?
Yeah, both good questions. And I'll address the first one in terms of prime contractor. So prime contractor is not a definition that's addressed in our act and regulations. It's something that's addressed in WorkSafe's regulations. And so it's not something we specifically address. But going back to the point of what prime contractor means, I think when we look at it's referring to the organization who's responsible. And so I think that does come into play in terms of the question of accountability and who's there and what each of their role is. And that plays into the second question, which is around the roles that each of the organizations or people involved played in the incident. And what's important to recognize is, I'll go back to a previous comment I made, is that we're not here in our team to point blame at a particular group. And in fact, we find that narrows the scope for change if we do that. And so what we try to do instead is look at how all the different parties interacted and how we can improve the situation and the environment they're in to make better decisions or safer decisions in the future. So each of them have a role to play in preventing that incident. The contractors, the owners, the qualified people that were present, they all have roles to play in maintaining the safety of that system and keeping people safe. And so we identified gaps and areas in a few different places, and that's where our recommendations came from. And that includes some responsibility on the regulator in terms of the codes and standards that we look to improve and create directives on to encourage better decisions in the future. So nobody is exempt, I think. Everybody has a role to play. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Ryan. We are coming up on time. I'm going to see if I can squeeze a few more in here. Another interesting question, I think, it relates back to maybe the verbiage question, but I'm going to ask it because I think there's an opportunity maybe to speak to the inner workings of the methodology behind the incident investigation, particularly with respect to other parties that might be involved. The question is, how do the various regulators talk to each other when there is an incident? Is there a formal process that regulators communicate to each other from the incident report and throughout the investigation?
I can speak a bit to that one. So within our province and the regulators within our province, we all investigate incidents with our own, intent. We're investigating under the Safety Standards Act for the purposes of learning. So another regulator, such as, for example, like a WorkSafe, when there's workers involved, may be investigating an incident as well. And we have some defined memorandums of understanding and information sharing agreements between ourselves and some other regulators where we do share some information about incident investigations that can be beneficial to each other. And sometimes we're actually standing shoulder to shoulder with them on scene. So yeah, so work is definitely done. If we can help the interest of another regulator, we're absolutely on board with it. We want our investigations and our findings to be used however possible to make things safer. When it comes to outside of our province, we do have a few lines of open communication with other regulators and other parts of industry. The other thing that we do when we have an incident investigation, especially larger scope ones like this, is really, while we're even in the investigation, try to identify what these messages are that can help improve safety, and then who the audiences are. How are we going to get it to them? Sometimes that includes other regulators as well. So once we have completed an investigation, our reports are published on our website for everybody to see. We may also take additional steps to reach out and connect with these other regulators or parts of industry to start discussions, really share the learnings and the findings, and encourage action to be taken to really learn from these and improve the safety of our systems in our province.
I'll just top up really briefly on that, Lisa. And great answer, Dean. I think how I would summarize it is that each of our investigations across the different regulators, we all have a differing interest in public safety. And so we each complete our own independent investigation, but they're done in parallel and collaboratively. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Ryan. Appreciate. I have a small window here. I'm going to ask or relay one more question because I think it's a fantastic question and note to wrap up with. How can we report companies which do unsafe work that can be dangerous to the public? We see a number of such companies here in Vancouver, and I can take that one. There are many avenues to report. Quickest way to access either our portal or the toll-free number is to just simply Google Technical Safety BC, report an incident or report a hazard. And so really encourage everyone to make use of that tool that is a driver in terms of inspection and assessment for our safety officers. And it is in fact where they spend quite a bit of their time. All of the notifications are triaged and investigated. And so again, encourage everyone to use that tool. I want to thank everyone for their participation today. There were a number of questions that we didn't get to. Again, those will be shared online on our website. And that brings us to the end of our event. And thank you again for spending the morning with us. We hope today's event has been valuable, and we invite you to keep in touch and engage with us through the options displayed on your screen there. Really the one in terms of our website or email alerts. And then lastly, once the session ends, you'll see a survey link on the screen. Please take a few minutes to complete it. Your answers really help us improve future events. We've seen some of them come through in the Q&A, so we'll factor those in as well. But again, if you haven't responded or engaged today, please go ahead and access the survey. And thank you again, and have a lovely day.